Let's see if this works. Is somebody here? If someone's here, can you just type in that you're here so I can see it? I want to make sure that it's getting out okay. Ooh, excuse me. I see 3 people. So can you? All right, beautiful, beautiful. All right, I can see inside. When I started this before, I wasn't able to see that. All right, good. So the other link is working okay. Hopefully everyone gets it. All right, there's 4 of you now. We're gonna wait a minute, make sure everyone gets that. There's thunderstorms here in Cromwell. There's a possibility that the power might go out, which is always fun. And my allergies are killing me right now. They're the worst they've been ever. We'll wait a couple more minutes. There's 6 of you in here so far. That's good. Oh, we just lost one. All right, beautiful. You guys are getting in. That's good. Sorry about the mix-up before, but I need you guys to be able to type in questions. That's how this works. And the other link wasn't allowing you to type in questions. So I wanted to make sure that that was all set. 7 of you. Nope, now 6. Why don't you guys, there's only 5 of you so far. We could have, oh, now 6. Again, we could have done this on Google Meets instead of this. Oh, 8, here we go. Now we're getting a few more. I mean, I suppose we could do these on Google Meets, but I think this might be better because I can record it just in case people aren't around, and I could basically just, answer questions from you guys. So here's how this is going to work. I'll wait 1 more minute, see if everyone gets in okay. Got 11. That's good. I'm just checking over here, see if I missed any messages in case somebody got kicked out like they did the last time. Yeah, it's pretty bad outside up here too. Now it's starting to rain. A lot of thunder. Lots of stuff going on. Sean, what do you mean the school accounts don't work? That's odd. Oh, it's restricted. Oh, that's odd. 15 of you are on this though, right? Very cool, Fiona. Nice to see you. Sorry, excuse me. I have really bad allergies. All right, good. So I don't know why this is restricted. I'm using my school account for this. Maybe I did something wrong. I'm not entirely sure, but I need you to do the live chat. So I can't check off that it's for kids with the live chat. So I don't know. I don't know what's going on, but I have 17 of you so far. So here's how this works. This is how we did it last year. So we have basically a topic to look at, period 3, unit 3, and some of unit 4, if it's appropriate for us to do that. Okay. So if you guys look at that unit outline, it starts to go over a lot of things. And what I want you to do is ask questions, and I'll be looking on the side over here to see your questions. Um, so first, let's start going over Unit 3 a little bit and just spend some time contextualizing Unit 3, which is what the beginning does here. It looks at Unit 3, where it says basically British attempts to assert tighter control over its North American colonies and the colonial resolve to pursue self-government led to a colonial independence movement and the Revolutionary War. So if you remember, we started looking at Unit 3 with the French and Indian War and how the British wanted to tighten up their control over the colonies. And that's where you get a lot of the actions from the British that make a huge difference in leading up to the American Revolution. So what sort of questions do you have about that? What are you, a big piece here that we looked at for a DBQ would be the American identity and how the American identity may have played a role in that. Some key concepts in this outline. It starts with the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. So you should be somewhat familiar with that. Some of the big things from the French and Indian War that you should focus on would be control of the Ohio River Valley, which was something that both the British and the French wanted to do. In fact, let me take out my my cheat sheet here. So control over the Ohio River Valley is something that they both wanted, and that's what eventually led up to that war, with the British and the French fighting over that land because it was the richest land in that part of the war, well, in that part of the country. So that's a big piece of it, and the colonies played a big role in fighting that war. If you remember, we talked a lot about this, and people like George Washington and others fought for the British in that war against the French. Pardon me for a moment while I go off camera. And I'm back. Okay, let's keep going here. All right. So, so a big piece of it was fighting over that land. But then if you remember, let's actually go through some of the big things leading up to the British really clamping down on the colonials and then the colonials doing something in response. And the first big thing, the first number one thing is the Proclamation of 1763. And if you remember that, the colonists that had fought so hard in that war had decided to, well, they wanted some of that land for themselves. But the British were like, you can't go into that land anymore. And then the colonials said, I will go into that land if I want to, right? And so they believed that that was one of their rights, their God-given rights to be able to take that land. It says, you shall never take this land from me. This is something I fought for me and for my children. So the Proclamation of 1763 basically said that the colonists could not go beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So this was a punch in the gut, a kick to the ribs, a smack in the face. Call it what you like, but it was something that these colonials did not want to sit idly by. So they started to get a little upset, not too upset. This is just one thing. All right, fine. They can have that. We don't need that land that bad. But then the British start doing some other things besides the land. They start doing all the different acts from the Grenville Program. Remember we talked about this? You have the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and the dreaded Stamp Act, among others. And the Stamp Act, of course, was the one that really pushed them over the edge. That was the one where they're like, all right, well, there's only so much a man can take, and there are certain rights that we all have, and it'd be nice if we can exercise all of those rights at some point. So The Stamp Act is what caused a ton of problems. And if we're really looking at the instances that led up to the colonists rebelling against the British, the Stamp Act was a big act because, here it is, get ready. This is a big piece here, all right? It's the first time the colonists agreed that this act was not cool. If you remember, during the French and Indian War, this guy, Ben Franklin, whatever his name is, hold on, let me see. So you can remember what he looks like, perhaps. You know, this guy. Oh, wait, this guy. See him? That's the guy. He's old. He's not, look, he looks all young in this thing, but let me tell you, he was 75 years old when the whole thing went down. So anyway, that guy came up with this thing called the Albany Plan. Remember that Albany Plan? We're join or die. And it was this whole notion where they would come up with some sort of a council that would work with the Native Americans and the British, and they would all come together to deal with the British Empire and blah, 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 blah. And the colony said, how about no? Okay? Why have an Albany Plan when we can just not? It's that simple. Okay? So anyway, they didn't agree. And the Proclamation of 1763 only hurt some parts of the colonies as opposed to others. Not everybody cared too much about that land. Certainly not in the South, because that wasn't on their border. It was more in the more middle colonies to New England. But then people started speaking out against the Stamp Act. This is something that hurt everyone. The Virginia House of Burgesses. But if you guys remember, we actually talked about this, where, Patrick Henry was like, if this be treason, make the most of it. And he said, give me liberty or give me death. All right, I'm fine. I'm okay. That was only acting. It was just a joke. Well, not a joke, but I was trying to stress the dramatic nature of the Stamp Act. And Patrick Henry was speaking out on what's known as the Virginia Resolves. Remember, we went over this? The Virginia Resolves, and where there was a list of resolves, resolved, we shall blah, blah, blah. In addition to that, all of the colonies met at this thing called the Stamp Act Congress. This was the moment where they started to shape an American identity. This is the moment where they started speaking out as Americans as opposed to British subjects. This is the moment where, if you were to write something about this, was a turning point, was a pivotal moment where things just started changing. From these acts, this isn't it. If I may remind you, this is only 1765. We don't rebel till 1776. It's 11 years later. But the British didn't let up. While they repealed the Stamp Act, they also do this other thing called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act basically said that the British had the right to tax the colonists if they chose. It's really that simple. It's like, I don't care what those colonists... Wait. I have to do a good King George. You have to be... I don't care what those colonists may have said. We can tax them anytime we like. And it is that simple. Meanwhile, back in America, we felt like, we did some great... Well, not me, because my family didn't get here till 1890s, for the record, which that's a whole other unit. That's in Unit 6. Unit 6. That's when my family gets here. But this is my wife's family who was here, right? The English were here. So we said, we felt that this was a great, great victory, and that this was something that we could, really hang our hat on. And so we continue, but the British keep sending people over, and then they keep doing these different acts in order to create revenue. Because remember, I forgot about this. See, this is why we're, doing this. Remember, the French and Indian War cost the British a lot of money. So the Proclamation of 1763 stopped any sort of hostility with the Native Americans. But in addition to that, the Grenville Program was supposed to produce some level of revenue from the colonies to help pay for that war, because the British believed that the war was there to protect the colonists. So, all right, we have that. We have those two acts. We have the Grenville program. We have the Stamp Act being repealed as a result of that. Any questions? Anything at all? I'm looking over, seeing if anyone has any questions. We're at 20 now. This is really cool. We're 15 minutes in and we got 20 people. What's up now? I'm just saying, this is live from Cromwell, Connecticut. All right. Not quite like Saturday night, but hey, it's Monday at 4:17. So we move on. Now, this all leads up to the two big moments that you learned about forever, the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre, of course, was the first one that happened in 1770. That if you guys remember, and I would recommend that you take a look at it again, we examined the etching by Paul Revere, which was a big piece of propaganda by the Sons of Liberty to try to get people on the side of the Sons of Liberty. Not necessarily a cause for independence, but a cause to assert natural rights. Natural rights, meaning that they were born with rights, the rights of Englishmen. And remember, this is another piece that we had actually talked a lot about, and it's good to review. And I would take note of this to go back and look through your notes. No pun intended. Well, no, anyway. When the British started to revolt against the crown, notice I said that, when the British started to revolt against the crown, the colonists were British. They were all British. Remember, the British are coming is not true. Redcoats, lobster back, something like that. When the colonists started to revolt, they were asserting their rights as Englishmen, as English people. Sorry, ladies. They were asserting rights that were given to them at birth. They were asserting rights that they believed that they were entitled to. They were entitled to move into the Western Territory. They were entitled to sell whatever they wanted to in the colonies and had established that. They were entitled to do all these things without the crown getting involved, especially given the fact that they were not represented in Parliament. You know, that whole no taxation without representation. That whole thing is true. It was oh gosh, what's his name? We went to his grave over in Boston. If somebody knows, type it in the side over there. And it was Joseph Warren. No, it's not Joseph Warren. It's Otis, James Otis. James Otis. James Otis is the one that came up with, it's not John Kennedy. John Kennedy is, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. John Kennedy's this guy right here, right? That's Jack. I'm just saying, when you know him as long as I've had, it's really Jack Kennedy. But in any event, it's James Otis, and we actually went to his grave when we were in Boston, and he's the one that came up with no taxation without representation. So all of this came out of Boston and Virginia, and the two leading colonies of this movement, which is no surprise that the first 6 presidents of the United States came from Massachusetts and Virginia. Isn't that interesting? Washington was Virginia, John Adams was from Massachusetts, Jefferson was from Virginia, Madison was from Virginia, Monroe, Virginia, and John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts. That's the first 6 presidents. But anyway, let's get back to this massacre and this Tea Party. The Tea Party was really big. And the issue of tea, the reason why it was so big is because the colonists it wasn't just about a tax on tea. It was about the fact that the crown was able to monopolize the tea industry by basically taxing all other merchants that sold tea, except for those that sold the crown's tea, the East India Tea Company. And they saw that as tyranny. This is tyranny. They're taking all the money. They're doing everything for them. So what you have here, when you bring all this together, is a series of usurpations, which is what they call it, and a pattern of behavior by the crown that eventually led to the first and then the Second Continental Congress. And that's where you see the American identity begin to solidify, and it begins to they begin to speak as one voice, as one country. And that's where you see it in earnest. You see representatives from all 13 colonies there at the Second Continental Congress. And you see them do a lot of important things because after the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts closed the ports, make it so that they would try soldiers over in Britain as opposed to in the United States or in the colonies. And they were known as the Coercive Acts, but we call them the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts were largely hated by the colonists. But it wasn't until a couple years after, it's more like a year and a half after the Boston Tea Party, that we see the first shots at Lexington and Concord. And that's where a lot of people believe that the revolution truly begins, when those first shots are fired and the Second Continental Congress appoints George Washington as commander-in-chief. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we get into the American Revolution in 20 minutes and 52 seconds. So questions on getting up to the American Revolution? Anything at all? Come on, ask away. I'm waiting. That was my little rant about the revolution. Stopping for a minute. Wow, it's really quiet when I stop talking. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee. Wait, any questions? Because the next piece is revolution. The revolution is important. Why didn't the colonists like the Albany Plan? That's a great question. A big reason why they didn't like the Albany Plan is because all the colonists had different interests. So do you remember we talk about sectionalism in Unit 5? So sectionalism was really a part of the colonial experience going all the way back to the formation of Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay. Think about it for a minute. And we spent a lot of time on this, even though period 2 isn't on the exam. Let's just sort of use that as an example. Massachusetts Bay was established after the original Plymouth colony, which was established because of religious persecution, or it was more of a religious colony. It was the Puritans that came here to settle the colony. And once they did that, they set up a different type of society, a different structure, as opposed to Jamestown, which was set up more for financial gain. And if you start to look at all of the colonies and how they were set up, which is something that we did at the beginning of the year, you'll see that each of those colonies had different reasons for setting up and also different interests, where the southern colonies were mostly interested in making money or cash crops, plantation economies, agrarian economies. That was a flash of lightning, by the way. Let's see how close it is. It's pretty close. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's shaking the house. So that was the South, as opposed to the North, where the North was based in communities. They had the town greens. They had all of those elements that led to a different type of society, and that would eventually foster industry to some extent. All right. So with all that in mind, what you're looking at are two different types of societies that begin to develop. And the Albany Plan of Union was basically trying to unite those two different types of societies with something very abstract, something that was something that wasn't quite it was more about creating a relationship with the crown, creating a relationship with Native Americans. And I think each individual colony would argue that it already had its own relationship with the crown. It already had its own relationships with the Native Americans. So there was nothing there to unite them. As opposed to the Stamp Act, everybody was affected by the Stamp Act. It was something that was universal from all the way as far as Massachusetts to as low as Georgia. So that's something that they could absolutely get behind. I know, girl, I know. The dog's a little scared. That thunder was pretty loud. All right, other questions? All right, give me one quick second. All right, and I'm back. Okay, that was our commercial break. Okay, now, any other questions? that brings us into the revolution itself, which is a big part of Unit 3. And what I want you to do is when you look at this revolution, don't think of it just as battles and turning points and things like that. I want you to think about it as a radical change in how the people relate with government. Think about it. It's basically admonishing monarchy and creating a republic. And the republic is really the revolutionary part of this moment within US history and a big part of our American identity. Because we were at that time the first republic since Rome. Now, notions of republicanism were at the heart of this revolution, and how they could create a republic, how they could be more like Rome. Even the Continental Congress, when you start to look at it, despite the fact that it was a loose confederation of colonies, when you start to break it down, and there wasn't a direct representative form of government, it was the best representative form of government they could do at the time. But I see the revolution as beginning in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence and ending with the inauguration of President George Washington. You have to sort of look at it that way, because the revolution wasn't just about getting the British out of North America. If you think about it, the British really weren't in North America per se. It's not like they always had troops here. It was also about reestablishing relationships between the people and the government. And that gets into a little bit of the civics that you did your sophomore year. The Declaration of Independence was an assertion of natural rights, was a way for the people to speak out and say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. All men are created equal has to do more with hereditary power, more to do with monarchical power, than it has to do with whether or not you are white or black. That plays a role later. Bear that in mind. That absolutely plays a role. And I would argue that it should be changed to all persons are created equal instead of all men are created equal. So that way we can also include women in this, Declaration of Independence. Perhaps it should be amended at some point. But all men are created equal. A lot of people take it literally to mean that, when in fact what it's saying, what Jefferson was trying to say, was that no king is above us. We are all equal. And that's where he was going with it. We all have natural rights, and above those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And when we start to look at it in those terms, that was a revolutionary thing to say when the world was filled with monarchies. So, as we're trying to establish a new republic, that's what the revolution truly is. Now, Washington crossing the Delaware, beating the Hessians at Trenton and Princeton, those are important moments and important turning points. The Battle of Saratoga certainly is a turning point that's important to recall because it brings the French into the war. And we don't win at Yorktown without the French Navy pushing Cornwallis to be trapped, because the British Navy can't come in and rescue him. So all of those things are important for reasons. And whenever you mention a turning point, it's important to say why it's a turning point. So if you mention Washington crossing the Delaware, you have to contextualize it. So it's such a turning point because Washington had been pushed out of New York into Pennsylvania and then did a sneak attack and beat what the world saw as the British. And it was a major boost in the morale of the people and for the cause. The Battle of Saratoga that actually happens after that becomes a turning point because the French say, well, maybe we should get involved in this war. So those are two important moments. And we needed the French in order to beat the British because we needed a navy and we needed more weapons because all of our resources were with the British. So now we have another resource. And now we can fight against the British. So when you're looking at the military aspects of the revolution, that's why that's important. And when you're focusing on the government, it is important to understand how the government changes. When we did this, we broke it up into three phases. We did the New England phase, which involved the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and Ticonderoga. Ticonderoga wasn't quite in New England, but it's a part of that phase. the Colonials or the Patriots without Tom Brady. Sorry, too soon? It's too soon. Sorry. All right. I won't. Okay. Anyway, the Patriots pushed out the British with the guns of Ticonderoga. If you remember, they actually set the guns up on Dorchester Heights and basically pushed the British out of Boston. Yay, we think we win this war. Then the British say, how about no? And then they actually come into New York, and that's where Washington is pushed out of New York. And that's in phase 2, which is known as the Mid-Atlantic region. We went over a lot of this in class. And then it was Christmas night, 1776, when you have the crossing of the Delaware. And the Battle of Saratoga happens in phase 2. And then phase 3 is the South, where the British try to rally loyalist support in the South, but it fails, and that's where they end up losing the war. And this is stuff that we spent a lot of time on. And the peace process takes place in France, and then the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783. It gives the United States basically their independence. It gives the French back their land that was taken from them from the French and Indian War. And I think the Spanish keep Florida, although we end up taking that back. So then you have in these notions of republicanism and this idea that the talents of everybody in this society will determine their place, not their birthright. Their birthright is something that's just not supposed to be relevant. And it should be hard work. And it should be Alexander Hamilton's a great example, where Alexander Hamilton was not born to any sort of royalty. He was actually born in the Caribbean, came up into the United States. He didn't know who his father was. This is a man who rises to great heights within American society. But for all intents and purposes, if he stayed in the British system, he would not get that far, which is what's so compelling about his story. So he was a huge architect of this new republic, him and James Madison, which is why my son's named Alexander James. And Sam, being the hellion that he is named after Sam Adams. I didn't realize that the personalities would actually match up, but they happen to. So it's kind of fun. I'm just kidding. I don't know if the personalities match up. I never met Sam Adams or Hamilton, but I've read a lot about him. In any event, this loose confederation of states, which was under the Articles of Confederation, started to set up. And then they find out that these Articles of Confederation aren't enough to bring this whole country together. So, and we figured that out with Shays' Rebellion. And it's Shays' Rebellion that actually pushes us over the edge. And we decide that we need a constitution. And, we need to revamp the Articles of Confederation, which leads up into the Constitutional Convention. Questions? We're 33 minutes in now. I want to see if you guys have any questions. You guys can interrupt me and ask questions, but no one wants to interrupt me. I'm doing okay, Sean. Thank you for asking. I do appreciate that. All right. So now, but before we get to the Constitution, you might also want to take a look at, don't forget the Northwest Land Ordinances. The Northwest Land Ordinances established a grid system, established when a territory can become a state. We went over these. Check out your notes. And that was the one thing from the Confederation period that stayed in place all the way up till the settling of land going into the 20th century, actually. So that's an important piece. It's also important when you start to look at Unit 5 and you start to look at expansion out west. The Northwest Ordinance of, I want to make sure I get the year right, so I'm cheating a little bit. I think it's 1787. Yep. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 said it divided the basically the Ohio River Valley up into 5 territories, and they ended up becoming 5 states. But when the population reached 60,000, it could then apply for statehood. But the big piece that actually I want to mention, which is important when you're looking at Unit 5 and you're looking at the issue of sectionalism, is the fact that in those territories, freedom of religion, the right to trial by jury, and no slavery were in those areas. So the issue of slavery was dealt with by Congress and basically said that Northwest Territory will not have slavery, which is why a lot of historians believe that the framers wanted to get rid of slavery. They look at this piece of legislation and they figure moving forward in new territory, slavery will not exist. Now, that's not the case, by the way, in the South, because as they add states in the South, such as Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, and moving out to the Mississippi River, they actually have slavery in those states. So that's not quite the case. And it isn't until the Missouri Compromise, which we'll talk about. Probably not tonight because my voice will end up failing me, but we'll figure out a way to add some stuff together before the test. That all this goes down, that it isn't until the Missouri Compromise that you start to see more legislation about Southern Territory moving west. All right. Now, to get into the Constitution itself, you guys know a lot about the Constitution. You've spent a lot of time on this. The Constitution is largely the result of our way of trying to define what republicanism is. It's a representative form of government. You have the big compromises, which I think you should familiarize yourself with again. Remember, the Great Compromise is the one where it took two different plans, the Virginia plan led by James Madison that wanted to create a representative government based on population in the legislative branch, meaning both the House and the Senate. He didn't call it that, but the upper house and the lower house would consist of population. And that's how you'd get representatives into those two houses, as opposed to the Patterson plan, which was the New Jersey plan, where they wanted just another article of another loose confederation, a one-house Congress, as opposed to a bicameral Congress, which is the one that Madison had suggested. And he just wanted to augment some of the powers of the federal government and just sort of redo the articles. Well, then you have our guy, Roger Sherman, coming in from the state of Connecticut that basically said, we're going to compromise and we're going to get both of those ideas out there, specifically in the legislative branch. And this is the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, where the House will be represented by the people based on population, and the Senate, every state will have two representatives despite their size, which is why the Senate consists of 100 people, and which is why the House of Representatives today is based on whatever the population is, which is why we need to make sure that we do our census, because the census will decide what the population of the country is, of each state, and then that will determine our representatives in that state. So that's the Great Compromise. But in addition to that, the Southerners believed that they wanted a little more representation in the House. So they come up with the 3/5 Compromise, and they count 3/5 of their slaves into the census. So that way they get more people into the House of Representatives. So their slaves are actually counted in that census, despite the fact that the slaves had no political or civic power within the South. So that's the 3/5 Compromise and the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. And then there was also the compromise where there would be no slave trade outside of the United States. So they would stop the slave trade for, in 20 years. So in 1807, because I believe this was adopted in 1787, 1807, they would stop the slave trade, the international slave trade, which they did. But people still illegally smuggled slaves in through Florida and the Caribbean. Okay, so now you have the Constitution of the United States. But of course, with the Constitution of the United States, you also have another debate leading up to the passage of the Constitution of the United States. And that, of course, takes place between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, don't get confused with the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Remember, those two groups are the first political parties of this country. The Federalists led by Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and then the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Remember, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists was a debate over whether they wanted to adopt the Constitution as the law of the land. And in fact, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were on the same side for this one. They were both Federalists, and they were the authors of the Federalist Papers, along with John Jay. Everyone forgets about John Jay. But it was Hamilton and Madison that actually wrote the majority of them. And then the Anti-Federalists were people like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry and Mercy Otis Warren. And the big things that the Anti-Federalists want, probably the one that was immediately addressed, was the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights was adopted by the first Congress. It's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. That Bill of Rights was largely negotiated by the Anti-Federalist passage of the Constitution from each state. And so that's the other piece, the other compromise that sometimes gets out of this whole series of compromises leading up to the adoption of this government. So I do want you to consider that too. So let's stop for a second here before we move on. I just want to go over some of the topics that we did. We talked a little bit about the 7 Years' War, the taxation without representation piece, and the Unit 3 guideline. The philosophical foundations of the American Revolution, you're looking at Enlightenment ideas. So it's important to go over Enlightenment, understand what the Enlightenment was, which was an idea, or which was a movement that started to challenge authority, specifically the Catholic Church in most cases. And it was a big issue between science and religion, which is another piece of the Enlightenment. And you start creating these thinkers about government, about power, about all of those ideas. So what a lot of historians argue is that the Constitution is the greatest achievement of the Enlightenment. And it wants you to, the U3 outline, these are things that we went over. I want you to know about the Declaration of Independence, because that's a part of that Enlightenment ideology. And common sense. Common sense is something that we also looked at, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. The revolution itself talks a little bit about some of the turning points that we went over, such as Saratoga and the crossing of the Delaware, and the influence of revolutionary ideas. This is something that we even talked about the other day in class. Republican motherhood, for example, is a revolutionary idea that women would actually bring up their children to be good, quote unquote, Republicans. That's one example of those Enlightenment ideas. The other one is the abolition of slavery, which you see come out of this. And the abolitionist movement, which begins with Quakers during the American Revolution, continues with people like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and others. So you start seeing revolutionary ideals come out of this movement. Let's see, what else do we have here? Articles of Confederation, we talked a little bit about. You know a little bit about that loose confederation, and then how that would eventually lead up to the Constitutional Convention and the debates over ratification, which we just went over. The Constitution itself, we talked a little bit about that. Notion of federalism is something that maybe you should review. Federalism meaning that there were powers divided between the state governments and the national government. That's an important concept. But also the notion of separation of powers and checks and balances. While those are civics, well, that's usually part of civics or a government class, it's certainly a piece of how the Constitution was framed, and it's certainly a big part of its ability to govern, where it took power and it divided it up, which is what the framers wanted. The framers were afraid of concentrated power. They believed with concentrated power, that's where tyranny came from. And the more you could break up power, the more you can check it, the better ability that the people will have to control the government. Because after all, it's we, the people, and that was a big piece of how they saw this government working out. Okay, so questions. Because the next section has to do with Washington and Adams a little bit, and then that's it for Unit 3. And we can maybe broach a little bit of Unit 4, but questions first. You guys don't have anything? It's all right. We're about 45 minutes in. You see, I still have 16 people. That's good. You guys are hanging in there. I do appreciate it. After the Constitution is passed, we get into the Washington administration. Now, Washington, the big moments for Washington, I would argue, would be, well, first of all, you have Hamilton framing his Bank of the United States, and yet another compromise happens there. I think we actually went over this in class the other day. That compromise has to do with the capital bill. I went over in one of the classes, the capital bill and the Bank of the United States, and where Jefferson and Madison agreed to support the Bank of the United States and Hamilton's whole economic plan, which involved not only the bank, but the assumption bill, where the federal government would assume the debt of the entire country, a Bank of the United States, and a tariff. So those are his big three pieces of legislation. In addition, the capital bill would be a part of that legislation, and Washington, D.C. would be in the South, not in the North. And at the time, I think at this point it was in, I think it was in Philadelphia by now, but it was in New York for a while too. So it was in Philadelphia and New York, and then finally it was in Washington, D.C. Washington never occupied Washington, D.C. John Adams was the first president to be in the White House, and it was toward the end of his term. Jefferson was the first president to be there for the full term. So these issues, such as the national bank, taxes, things like that, were what developed, and the power of the federal government, were what developed that first political party system. The first two-party system in the United States, which were between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And that's where you start seeing these issues being discussed and debated at that level. The other thing, and you guys should probably take a look at the differences between Republicans and, Democratic Republicans and Federalists. In fact, I'll share that piece with you once this is over. Hey, Carson, I'm sorry that it wouldn't let you use your school accounts. I'm going to be able to publish this, so that way you'll be able to watch it. So it should be okay. And really, no one's really asked any questions. But if you have a question, by all means, jump in. All right. Yeah, and I see that you're yelling in that. Sorry about that, Carson. I don't know why I was doing that. The other thing that I want you guys to focus on under Washington would be the foreign policy aspect, which is very small. But on the same note, it's somewhat telling when you look at his farewell address. So you have a couple things here. First, the Proclamation of Neutrality, where Washington decided that he would not take a position between the British and the French. So by proclaiming neutrality, that was something that he felt he needed to do because he had a relationship with the British because of so here's the second thing, the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty was organized to create a good relationship with the British, a trade relationship, in fact, because that was a relationship they had prior to the Revolution. Hamilton's economic plan was contingent upon trade with the British, not the French. And if you review some of the major differences between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, you'll see that the Democratic Republicans favored the French and the Federalists favored the British. But in Washington's farewell address, it talks a lot about avoiding entangling alliances and trying to stay away from relationships with other countries, because that could, in effect, hurt the United States. That was one of the things. The other thing was to avoid political parties, and they did not do that. Why did Spain allow the U.S. the Mississippi River for trade in Pinckney's Treaty? Really good. That's a really good question, Giovanna. The reason why the Spanish did that is because we were trading. We started to trade things such as tobacco, rice, and cotton was on the verge of becoming a major commodity. We had a difficult time getting it from the deep South states like South Carolina, Georgia. Well, more like Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky. South Carolina and Georgia had their own ports on the East Coast, but Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, they needed a way to get their goods out into global trade. So Pinckney's Treaty played a big role in that. And navigating the Mississippi was something that we needed to do in order to begin trade, which is why Pinckney's Treaty is important for that. And that was with the Spanish as opposed to the English, as opposed to the Jay Treaty, which basically recognized American sovereignty in the Northwest, but it also provided for a good trade deal. And so I don't know, does that answer your question? I'm hoping it does. Maybe a thumbs up, kind of, sort of. Well, I'll just hope that it answers your question, because I can't. Oh, yes, perfect. Thank you. You rock, Giovanna. All right. So now, where was I? Oh, then, so after Washington leaves office, after that farewell address, which I do recommend you take a look at, we looked at parts of it in class, and we talked a little bit about it. So take a look at your notes on that one. After the farewell address, you have John Adams' administration, and he actually gets involved with a war with France after the XYZ affair, which we talked a little bit about. And the XYZ affair essentially led to a quasi-war with the French, a naval war mostly. But it also led to probably the more significant elements of that administration would be the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Alien and Sedition Acts basically said that the United States placed obstacles in the way of people to immigrate into the United States, mostly from France, because they didn't want any French immigrants coming over and criticizing the government. And the Sedition Act, where people were not allowed to speak out against the government in times of war. And the Sedition Act actually imprisoned 10 editors that Thomas Jefferson had paid to write editorials about John Adams. And they put him in prison, which basically the Sedition Act led to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which basically was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison trying to say that if a state disagrees with a law, they have a right to and they have a right to nullify that law, and the state doesn't have to listen to it. And the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were the basis for the nullification crisis under John C. Calhoun. So that's the Alien and Sedition Acts, which led up to what's known as the Revolution of 1800, which was the election of Thomas Jefferson as President of the United States. And he saw that as a revolution because he saw it as an extension of the American Revolution, because it was the first time in history where you have a change in political power, meaning a change from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans, without any sort of war, without any sort of major conflict. And that finishes up Unit 3. Questions on the review of Unit 3? That's a lot. And I talked for a long time. And there's only 13 of you now. Are you going to post this live stream so we'd be able to? Yes, I am. I'm going to post it as soon as it's over. In fact, I think if you use this link, you should be able to get to it. So it's already posted technically. That's a good question. All right. So the real question here is, should we do Unit 4 tomorrow and sort of combine Unit 4 and a little bit of Unit 5, because it kind of works into Unit 5 a little easier? No problem, Sarah. I'm thinking we're an hour in right now. Thinking we should hold off and do Unit 4 tomorrow, but Maybe we just go over a little bit of Unit 4. What do you guys think? Maybe just a little bit? Can I get a thumbs up, a thumbs down, something on the side over here? Do you have the ability to do that? I mean, Sean was able to do the poop emoji, so I'm pretty sure you can do the thumbs up or thumb down, right? Anyone? You want me to continue? I can continue for a little bit, but I just want to make sure that you guys want to watch. Let's do about half of it. I got a thumbs up. All right, let's do it. Yeah, let's just do a little bit. Let's take a look at the take a look at the oh, nice, Sean. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. All right, here we go. All right, let me go into the iCloud Drive. Bear with me for a minute. I just want to get the correct Unit 4, because I want to make sure that I go through it. Hold on. Oh, here it is. All right. So Unit 4 covers 1800 to 1848. We're not going to go over all of it. Basically, let's talk about, so this is a period where you're looking at the nation's transition from the revolution into this early republic period, the Great Experiment period. This is what a lot of people call it. It's a moment where you see people moving westward. It's where we have Manifest Destiny. And it starts off with the age of Jefferson. So let's just go over that a little bit. The age of Jefferson focuses on some important moments, and they want you to understand some of the big Supreme Court decisions, which we went over a bunch of them. The biggest one, of course, is Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison established judicial review. And what it basically did was John Marshall, who was the Supreme Court, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during this period, argued that the court has the right to nullify law. And in this case, it nullified the Judiciary Act of 1789. And Marbury versus Madison, when it did that, it set a precedent for judicial review. And with that, you have the Supreme Court, the judicial branch of the United States, interpreting the law as it is as it's presented to them. And so we have several times in U.S. history where the Supreme Court changes the law. One of the more famous one is Plessy versus Ferguson, which argued for segregation in 1896, and Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 repudiates that law by saying separate is not equal. And that's where we start seeing the desegregation of the South and a lead up into the civil rights movement. The Supreme Court is known for a lot of groundbreaking decisions. We went over a bunch of those decisions, and that would follow in this period here. The Supreme Court decisions especially would be Gibbons versus Ogden, which had to do with regulating interstate commerce. Cohen, no, I don't want to do that one. Dartmouth College versus Woodward, which basically talked about the charter of Dartmouth College was a contract and the state had no right to interfere with it. And in a lot of these cases, which I do recommend you take a look at these, Dartmouth versus College, Gibbons versus Ogden. In a lot of these cases, it was the Supreme Court enhancing the federal government's power, whether it be through interstate commerce, whether it be in contract law, or whether it just be in the whole notion of nullification itself, the nullification of a law by the Supreme Court with its judicial review. So take a look at those Supreme Court decisions. We spent a lot of time on those. The other thing that this period talked about is the Louisiana Purchase. And the Louisiana Purchase really started to foster that whole notion of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny meaning that the United States should begin to think about moving out west and moving into that territory. Lewis and Clark does their famous expedition, but largely I want you to focus on the notion of manifest destiny, because part of that Louisiana territory is where the Missouri Compromise comes in. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because the Missouri Compromise in this section. The other piece that's in this section, if we're talking about the Missouri Compromise and certainly sectionalism, is well, first, moving out west. I might be getting ahead of myself. Let me say this first. Sorry. The War of 1812 is a piece of it. So if I'm going chronologically, this would make more sense. Remember we talked about the War of 1812? War of 1812 was about trade, pride, and expansion. Trade, where the United States was, oh, I like that. I got a little like sign. Nice. Trade in that we were trying to trade with the British, trying to trade overseas. And the British kept interfering with that, with with their impressment of our citizens. They would go on merchant ships and they would impress American citizens, saying that they belonged in the British Army or in the British Navy. So that's where the trade comes in, and we kept trying to trade with other countries, but the British kept getting in the way. And then you have expansion, where the United States tried to expand into the Northwest Territory region, where the British never fully left. And they actually gave Native Americans weapons to fight back against our expansion into that territory. So that's where the expansion comes in. The pride piece comes in that the United States wanted to assert itself overseas, wanted to show the world that it was a powerful nation and that it should be recognized as such. And by taking our citizens and impressing them and giving weapons to the Native Americans to help them push us back was threatening our sovereignty. So that was where pride comes in, a threat of our sovereignty. So trade, pride, and expansion. So we go to war. It's largely a stalemate. We do not win the War of 1812. But what we do is we start to solidify ourselves as a country that will fight for its territory, that will fight for its citizens. And that's the biggest lesson that we could take from the War of 1812. So there's a sense of nationalism that comes out of the War of 1812. And that nationalism is embodied not only in the war, but also with the Supreme Court decisions, and also with, if you remember this, the American system. So some of the big proponents of that war were Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. And those are the big three. They end up being the big three senators that control a lot of the political issues in the United States in this period leading up into the antebellum period just before the Civil War. Daniel Webster was from the North. He was from Massachusetts. Henry Clay was from the West. He was from Kentucky. And so the West was seen as an important region, as an important section of the United States as we were moving westward. And John C. Calhoun was from South Carolina, and he was from the South. Those three politicians are the big three that really shape how things are done in the United States in Congress. Henry Clay in particular came up with the American system. Maybe you guys remember this. The American system was a combination of reestablishing the Bank of the United States, putting money into road construction, and coming up with a new tariff to help bring revenue to the United States as well as protect American businesses. That's the American system under Henry Clay. He especially wanted the infrastructure money to build roads because he was in the West and he needed ways to get our goods, to get his goods in particular, out into the world, out to the East Coast. These are big issues in the early Republic period. Think of the United States as this vast amount of land that had no way to really travel. And we had to build that from scratch. And infrastructure became a big piece of the early Republic period because it doesn't only manifest itself with roads, it also does it with canals and with the invention of steamboats. And this is where you have that innovation coming into full effect and playing a big role connecting each part of the United States. So not only they can move goods, but they can move people, and they could start to move into this Western territory. Excuse me. Questions? Hold on, I want to look at the unit here. Look, the politics and regional interests, American system, that's in here. War of 1812 is in here. I already talked about that a little bit. You know what else we should actually mention right around this period, just before the age of Jackson? Two important things. One, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, sort of moving into that whole notion of nationalism, is an example of American nationalism because it's telling the world, don't mess with our shores, we won't mess with your shores. So the Monroe Doctrine is an example of American nationalism. After the War of 1812, we wanted to make it clear to the British, clear to the French, clear to everyone, stay away from Latin America, stay away from our hemisphere, and we'll stay away from your hemisphere. And when you think about it, we didn't really have the ability to enforce that, but the mere fact of saying it is a way for the United States to um, step up and enforce their notion of sovereignty. And it comes back to that. That's that pride again, that trade, pride, and expansion. So the fact that they're a sovereign nation and they want it to be listened to. So that's very, very important. That's where the Monroe Doctrine plays a role. So oftentimes within American history, just before I move on to this other point, remember, it's not always the literal translation of what we're looking at. Sometimes it could be symbolic. Because the Monroe Doctrine, if you literally translate it, there's no way we can enforce that. But when you look at it in the broad context of the early Republic period, and in the broad context of this evolution of American power and of who we are as a country and an American identity, it's a benchmark in where our leaders were basically saying, look, we're a country, we want to be acknowledged as a country, and you need to start doing that. So that's important. And if you were to talk about something like the Monroe Doctrine in an essay, or talk about something like the American system, those are things that are uniquely American. And you can even find nationalism within the American system in the same way you can with the Monroe Doctrine, because it's basically, it's saying that our systems are good, that they are something that we believe in. And that's a notion of nationalism, and it enhances our sovereignty. So think about it in that respect whenever you're trying to talk about these things. Because there's always a little, the reason why we take these moments and we look at them is because they are benchmarks and they are sort of points where you start to see an evolution of character, an evolution of the American identity. You see that again, you see that also with the second piece that I think is important to acknowledge in this unit, and that's the market revolution. And the market revolution is important for a variety of reasons. It's not just about making money and about transporting goods. It's once again about touting the American innovations that we come up with. The first factories, while they were based on what was going on in Britain, the American system of factory work was changed around this time with the Slater Mills in Rhode Island and the Lowell Mills in Massachusetts. And you start seeing American factories begin to generate goods at a fast rate. And this new market revolution had to do with resources in the South. And this feeds into the foundation for Unit 5, where the Southern planters and the cotton industry in the South had a relationship with the textile owners in the North. And they needed that relationship in order for the American economy to work, which is why the Northern capitalist wasn't against slavery as much as the Northern abolitionist, which is why we have to make a distinction between the two. The abolitionist is against slavery. People like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and company. They were against slavery, and they were in the North. There were other people who owned the textile industry, where they didn't have a huge issue with slavery because it actually fed into their business. Where they stood morally on it isn't as obvious, but the fact is that they benefited economically from it. And that's where you see this symbiotic relationship between the South and the North, where they needed each other, which is why we have the Lords of the Loom and Lords of the Lash. We talked a little bit about this. Remember, not Fruit of a Loom, Lords of a Loom. And Lords of the Loom were in the North, and those Lords of the Loom were the ones that controlled a lot of the textile industry and the business within the northern states, as opposed to the Lords of the Lash, who were controlling the slave labor in the South. So that's a piece of it. And the market revolution was about a lot of things. It was about innovation. within the textile industry. It was about innovation within transportation. So the transportation with the canals, and then the early railroads, not the later railroads. That's a little different. After the 1860s, you see railroads boom. But these are the early railroads just before the antebellum period. Um, Certainly the roads that we had mentioned with the American system, but it's also about communication with the telegraph and the use of the telegraph, and how that played a role in moving goods and communicating with all these different towns. Um, so it's about transportation networks, it's about communication networks, and that's where you start seeing this new market revolution begin to develop, that really takes hold after the Civil War. And some historians argue, and we'll see this in Unit 5, that the economy sort of went on pause a little bit because the war itself, um, it stopped our ability to continue with progress in this country because we were so involved in that war. Despite the fact that it was, this guy right here, Lincoln, hold on, got to get him in, was, Lincoln, who actually passed the Homestead Act in 1862 during the Civil War, and actually passed the Transcontinental Railroad Act. I think it was also in 1862. So it's not like we weren't thinking about moving westward, nor was it that we weren't thinking about commerce and the ability to trade with other nations while we were in the Civil War. It's just we didn't have the resources to follow through on it because we were at war. So that sort of paused in this development, which you start to see right here in this early Republic period, and this market revolution that plays a big role. Steam engines, interchangeable parts, all of those elements of this movement, they all came together in a confluence of ideas that shaped this new market economy. And these are all things that you've already learned about. These are all things that just sit and think for a second. Once again, all this innovation, think of today, think of social media, think of technology, think of internet, just the ability that we're able to do this at 5:15 outside of school hours and review for the exam is very innovative. But it also is a confluence of technology, ranging from connectivity with an internet provider to a computer that has the ability to do this, to the internet itself that can actually create this whole environment. Well, that confluence of innovation is the same thing that happened in the United States just after the War of 1812, leading up to the Civil War. And that's how that market economy begins to develop. And it becomes uniquely American in a lot of ways, specifically the notion of interchangeable parts, which is taken for granted today, where I could theoretically take apart this MacBook Pro and another MacBook Pro of the same model, mix up the parts and put it back together again, which I've done, but I did it with an old Mac and I left out some screws, but it still worked, so it's fine. I'm just saying it worked. I changed out the screen in an old MacBook, but it worked because of interchangeable parts. It still works, I think, somewhere, but it's pretty old and I don't really use it anymore. So that's that market revolution. And the market revolution itself, you're looking at not only growth in manufacturing, but also change in societal norms, whether it be the role that women played in the factory, which was a new trend within American history, and certainly contributed to the feminist movement that was going on. A strong surge of free labor in the North, wage labor in the North versus slave labor in the South. And those are important differences when we're looking at the issues leading up to the Civil War. But then I'm gonna hold off because then it gets into the age of Jackson here, and I might save Jackson for tomorrow because Jackson's a lot of fun to do, and then we can lead into the Civil War a little bit. So questions? Any questions at all? We're about an hour, 15 minutes. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're at about topic 4.7 on your Unit 4 outline right now. So we're going to pick up with 4.7 tomorrow. But before you go, I'm going to see you guys tomorrow. But let's just try to figure out this whole issue with the with the accounts, so I know what's going on, and so that way everybody could access it. So I'm going to try to figure that out between now and tomorrow. Meanwhile, this is going to be available, so please let your friends know that if they missed it because of a problem with the accounts, that it should be available at this link. Are there any questions? No questions? Was this helpful? I'll take the thumbs up again. If it was helpful, please. No poop emoji, Sean. Was it helpful? My son liked the poop emojis, though. All right. Well, we'll talk tomorrow. All right. Okay. Good. Thank you. Thank you. All right. We'll talk more tomorrow. My wife is making something amazing in the other room. I don't know what it is, but it smells fabulous. So I want to go check that out. And I'm going to try to figure out what's up with your accounts. You're very welcome. This was a lot of fun. I would talk longer, but I think an hour 15 is a good place to stop. Meanwhile, rest easy, read history, study hard, know that I'm proud of you, and you're going to do really well on Friday. And I'll see you tomorrow. All right? Take care, everyone, and have a great night. Bye-bye.
The duty's out.